Good evening, everyone. There's some seats up front for the folks standing in back. If you want to get a spot, there's in the first few rows there's some seats. Well, thank you for the kind introduction, Karina. Thank you for inviting us, and thank you all for coming out tonight. It's already been a long day, but boy, this is an exciting topic, and there's a lot going on here. My name is Marc Jones. I manage public sector at Cast Software. We're an organization that has been supporting government agencies at the state level, federal level, IC space, DoD space for a number of years. Over the last year or so, we've been rolling out a solution called Cast Highlight. And Cast Highlight is really designed as you're entering your journey into the cloud. One of the conversations we have a lot, whether you're an organization supporting the government or whether you're on the government side, is, we see requirements coming out. We need to have 100 applications in the cloud by the end of May. We have a target of 800 applications that get to the cloud by some date. What we also see is a lot of times those dates slip, and a lot of times there's not very much of there's not a very solid decision criteria about maybe how to establish those waves and how to bring those applications out. We're going to talk tonight about how you take a portfolio approach and actually think in terms of understanding what's inside the applications at the code level to help you organize your thinking about what to move to the cloud and how to sequence those moves. We're super thrilled to be a part of the intake process for the Air Force Cloud One contract. This is roughly 1,000 applications over 3 years kind of target, and much more to do there. We have great partners to work with on this. I'm going to hand over to Greg Rivera, who's the product manager of Cast Highlight. He came down from New York for this meeting today, so thank you very much for doing that. But I would like to say we're very interested in working with the partner community. And as you're in meetings and you're talking to clients, whether you're internal or talking to clients about this notion of planning and sequencing the portfolio, keep Cast Highlight in mind. It's something that I think can add a lot of value to this. So without more ado, I'll hand it over to Greg.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Greg Rivera, and I lead the Cast Highlight product for the company. And Highlight is a application portfolio analysis platform. It's got a number of different use cases. But over the last year, the primary use case that we've seen growing the quickest is essentially helping organizations better plan and prepare and strategize for assessing application migration to the cloud, and specifically adopting Azure PaaS services. Now, the reality is over the last decade or so, most of the legacy migration to Azure and any public cloud platform for that matter has been using that more straightforward approach that Vishwas was talking about, the rehost or lift and shift to infrastructure as a service, or IaaS. It's a more straightforward, kind of simpler approach. It's quicker. But the reality is, and we did some research last year with a third-party company across a number of industries that have been doing primarily this kind of more lift and shift rehost migration strategy. The reality is that less than 40% of them are actually realizing the true promise or benefits that they were expecting or hoping for after the cloud migration. And most of them kind of consider the migration to be unsuccessful. And that's because although that lift and shift is a little simpler, it doesn't give you the opportunity to take advantage of the true promise of those wonderful PaaS services, things like ML or AI, a lot of those services that Vishwas was talking about earlier. But there's a good reason why the lift and shift has been the dominant approach. It's simpler, it's quicker. Doing that more refactor approach to platform as a service takes a little bit more thought, a little bit more time. Sometimes it requires skill sets that the organization doesn't have, or the organization simply doesn't have the insight or the knowledge that they need to properly plan and execute that type of migration. So what we're going to talk about today is cover what are kind of 3 of the most common hurdles to doing an Azure PaaS migration. First off, how to build just that overall roadmap that helps you figure out how to get started. Where do you start? How do you start to segment and prioritize different workloads in a portfolio and how you plan to migrate them to Azure PaaS services. Secondly, finding some quick wins. when you're doing something for the first time or a little bit different than you have in the past, gaining some quick confidence and credibility across the organization is obviously sometimes pretty magical in terms of setting up the rest of the plan. And then finally, specifically, identifying what are those potential obstacles or roadblocks that could get in the way or prevent the migration, and finding those early before you start the process so that you could address them before you start putting in the time and effort and work to refactor an application, for example. So some organizations are taking a different approach, and they're using what we call software intelligence. This is essentially a category that CAST has been in for many years. And the way to think about software intelligence is imagine it being an MRI machine for your software. It's an approach where you're analyzing your application software source code to get insights into things like the quality, security, and now more recently, the cloud readiness of your workloads. All right? So this is very different than other platforms out there that are assessing or analyzing infrastructure. It's not like an APM, application performance monitoring platform, or it's very different than something like Microsoft's Movere. It's very complementary to those platforms. We do not monitor what's going on in runtime or production. We're analyzing the source code, trying to find out what's going on in the code itself to uncover these potential roadblocks to migrating or refactoring an application for migration to PaaS. So that's an important thing to understand. So what I'm going to demonstrate to you in just a moment is a few things. First off, how to take a step back and look at a portfolio of workloads or applications and build that roadmap to the cloud, identifying how to segment and prioritize applications for different methods for migration. So that's number one. Number two, how to quickly find some quick wins. Identify those opportunities that are help you gain some confidence and credibility. And then finally, uncovering what those obstacles or potential hurdles are early enough in the process so that you could address them before migration. So that could be, linkages between apps, app-to-app dependencies. Or it could be getting into the individual application itself and identifying what are those potential roadblocks in the code itself. For example, is an application, a simple example, using a hard-coded IP address. That's obviously not going to work very well if you're going to migrate that application to the cloud. Things like that. All right. Okay. So let's go ahead and switch over to a demo here. So what do I need to, there we go. This is going to be kind of hard to do in this mode. So could I switch it to mirroring?
Yes.
Yeah, that'll be easier. Okay. Yeah, let's do that. So, cool. Perfect. All right. Thanks, Vishwas. Give me a second here to log in. The beauty of live demos. Of course. There we go. Okay, so what I am looking at right here is the home screen for Cast Highlight. So again, Cast Highlight is an application portfolio analysis platform. It's running on Azure. And the example that I'm going to walk through here is a pretty small portfolio of about 60 applications, as you can see down in this little box here. Right? And the first thing that's going to probably draw your attention is these kind of four main tiles at the top here. These are our four primary software intelligence measures, if you will, that are built into the platform. So a couple of quick definitions for you first. The first one here, resiliency, software resiliency. This is just a measurement of reliability or robustness based on software engineering industry best practices. Right? Agility is a measurement of how easy it is to maintain or upgrade an application. Elegance is a pure complexity metric. These first three here, we typically refer to these collectively as our health measures. And I'll touch on these very briefly, but we're going to spend most of our time on this fourth one, which is pretty self-explanatory, which is called cloud readiness. All of these are scores on a scale of 0 to 100. And cloud readiness is specifically measuring how ready an application, or in this case, a portfolio of applications, is to be migrated to Azure PaaS. Right? So if I click on this, this is going to take us to one of our portfolio level dashboards. And I'll show you a little bit about what's going on here. So in this dashboard, I'm going to see if I zoom in. It might be a little easier. Actually, I'm zooming out so you could see the whole thing. Okay. So I'll describe what's going on because the screen's a little small for some of the folks in the back. But what we see here is a dashboard that has every application in the portfolio on this grid with the X and Y axis. Each one of these icons represents a different application or workload in the portfolio. On the vertical axis on the left there, you can't really read it, is one measure which is business impact. That's the importance or impact of the application or workload to the organization. And on the horizontal axis is our cloud ready index. How ready is this application to be migrated to Azure PaaS? Right? Both of those are on a scale of 0 to 100. Now, the cloud ready score is primarily coming from an analysis of the source code of the application. That analysis happens on-prem, locally, no source code ever leaves the premises, and the business impact measurement is coming from a survey. So we do have some survey elements built into the platform in addition to analyzing source code and actually looking at the technology itself. And then finally, the size of the icon currently represents the number of roadblocks that are preventing a migration, but I could change that to things like lines of code to get a size of the application, number of FTEs supporting the application, et cetera. The way you might use this is just a very simple example, is to start building that roadmap and segmenting and prioritizing applications for the cloud. So for example, you might start with a segment in the lower right here we call quick wins. These are applications that are more cloud ready, but lower on the business impact scale. So maybe you pick off a few of these, like let's say, for example, these 3 or 4 applications here. Smaller bubbles, meaning they have less roadblocks to address before migration. And because they are lower on the business impact scale, if something were to happen during this initial phase of the migration, they're not going to have as material of an impact on the business. So a great place to start and find some quick wins. There's another segment in the upper right here we call core cloud. These are applications that are also highly cloud ready, but they're also highly strategic to the organization. So maybe this is where you're going to put a lot of your effort and resources, especially to refactor these applications and start taking advantage of platform as a service services, some of those things that Vishwas was describing earlier. Long-term bets. These are applications in the upper left. Right? These are apps that are also important to the organization, but have a lower cloud readiness. They're going to need more work, more time and resources to make them cloud ready and take advantage of PaaS. So maybe you actually segment these into a rehost or a lift and shift bucket, because they're going to go to the cloud at some point, but you're going to push that work, since it's that much more effort, off further down the line, and maybe you do the refactor later on. And then finally, we have a segment in the bottom left called Pursue Later. These are apps that are both low on the business importance and less cloud ready. In fact, maybe you look into the functionality or purpose of some of these workloads and identify potential opportunities for retirement or even replacement. If you're using Office 365 or SharePoint, maybe there's some functionality in one of those platforms that could essentially replace workloads that are not strategic and are going to need a lot of work to migrate. Right? That might be the better choice. So again, just a very simple example of using a portfolio level view to start trading that roadmap to the cloud. Now very quickly, I'm going to look at one other dashboard here at the portfolio level before we start looking at a specific application. This is a different dashboard that starts to incorporate the concept of health. If you recall earlier, I was describing some of those health measures when I first introduced the home page. And what we've done here is we've taken the cloud readiness score and put that on the vertical. And now on the horizontal, we have one of our health metrics. In this case, you can't read it, but it says software resiliency. Resiliency is a measurement of reliability or robustness. Or another way I like to think about it is, you can almost think of software resiliency as an early warning system for how likely an application is to be prone to production issues or outages based on the software engineering or coding practices that we find in the source code. Green is very good, orange in the middle, red not so good. So I'm going to hover over one of these bubbles, one of these workloads right now. You can't really see it too well, but a little ID card pops up when I hover over it in the upper right. This is an application called Closure. And if you were to just look at the cloud readiness data on this application, it looks like a really good migration candidate. It's got a cloud ready score of over 70, which is pretty good. The number of roadblocks that we found in the code was 74, which is relatively small, comparable to a lot of the other workloads in the portfolio. So it looks like a good candidate. You might actually have considered to migrate that in a early phase of the project. However, when you look at the health scores, you'll see that it's got low resiliency and even worse, agility and elegance by those three red rectangles there. What that means in layman's terms is this is an application that's probably prone to production outages. It's very hard to upgrade and maintain it, and it's written in a very complex manner. This is an unhealthy application, and an unhealthy application on-prem is going to be an unhealthy application in the cloud. So you might deprioritize this application based on this additional insight and try and fix some of these health issues before you start going forward with a migration. Okay. So let's start taking a closer look at maybe an individual application. So I'm going to start at a dashboard that we call our application links dashboard. And what this is allowing us to do is to start looking at the interdependencies between applications, the communications going on between them. This data could be coming from an APM tool, an infrastructure assessment tool like a Microsoft Movere or something of that nature, or it could be filled out via a survey by application owners that know what the communications are going on between applications. Regardless, the data could come from multiple places. And once you have that data, we just give you a way to visualize that. So let's take a look or focus on one application. I have one application here that if I zoom in, it's called Blue Sky, right? And I have a couple of other applications that it's interacting with here. And I can see it's bidirectional with one. You can't really see the color coding here, but the legend shows that these are API connections. Okay, so API connections, that's probably something that I could deal with if I wanted to migrate this application, Blue Sky, to the cloud. So let me drill into that a little further and take a closer look. So I'm leaving the portfolio level and now going down to one specific application. As you can see here, I have those same measures I had at the portfolio level, but now I'm at the app level, so I still have my resiliency, agility, elegance scores, my cloud ready score. I have some custom metrics here in these darker gray boxes. We do some pretty cool things at the app level here, but I'm going to just focus in two areas in the interest of time. All right? So the first one is what we call software composition. The other thing that we're doing when we are analyzing the source code, looking for roadblocks, developing these scores around health and cloud readiness, we're also automatically detecting any open source or third-party components or frameworks being used within the code. Right? And the reason we do that is because there's certain implications there. Based on third-party or open source components, there could be vulnerabilities in the code. In this case, this application has 21 critical and 13 high-severity vulnerabilities. These are things that probably should be addressed before a migration. So we could take a look at one example. Here's a component here that has a bunch of vulnerabilities in it. If I go ahead and open that, that'll take a second to load. I can see that I'm currently using this open source component in my code, and the version I'm using is almost 2 years old. And that's one of the reasons why it has so many security vulnerabilities. But if I look and upgrade this component to the most recent version, which is a few months old, I'll see those vulnerabilities have been removed. This data is coming directly from the National Vulnerability Database, and I know it's a bit of a digression from cloud, but it's something important to recognize when planning on migration that there's other implications, especially if your developer teams are using open source components and frameworks in their development practices. There also might be some licensing implications here that I'm not going to spend much time on. So to kind of finish up, the last piece I'm going to show is how deep we go at the application level to demonstrate the cloud readiness of an application. So this application, still on the same one, has a cloud ready score of 60.3. That's calculated based on a weighted average between some survey questions, which we see here, and the code scan. So let's switch over to the code scan data. What we see here is that this is an application that's made up of a couple of technologies. In fact, I'm going to go back to the bigger view here. It's got some C# primarily code. It's also got some T-SQL code. We could look at it individually or all together. And basically what we're showing here is a list of all the patterns that we're finding in the code. And we have two types of patterns we're looking for. We're looking for blockers and boosters. Blockers are things that are going to prevent or make a migration harder to Azure PaaS. Boosters are good practices, or things that are already going to help make the app more cloud ready. Like maybe the development team is already using certain types of best practices that work well in the cloud. And some of them are going to be Azure specific. So if you see the little red bars or red on the right here, that means it's a roadblock or a blocker. If you see green, that means it's a booster. That's a positive thing. So these things we're counting them, and it's developing that score. And we'll quickly take a look at one of them. So I'll sort it by this last column here. So the second one here, using COM components. It's a very common practice in an on-prem C# application, but it's not going to necessarily work well in an Azure PaaS environment. We provide a bunch of data here. I could simply click on this last column here, which shows that we found 32 occurrences of the use of COM components in this application. It shows which files that was found in, and if I ever want to find more information about why that's an issue, I could simply click on this question mark, and it brings us to our knowledge base, which gives a lot more background information there. All of the information that we're seeing here, you can export to Excel. We also have PowerPoint, so you can create executive presentations. And finally, the last thing I'll show is that we've also got a plugin available for Azure DevOps. So if your team is using that environment for development, working on source code, you could actually scan the code, pull in the metrics, everything I was just looking at in our interface from inside of Azure DevOps without leaving Azure DevOps. So that's just another way we're seeing a lot of organizations kind of automate this process and start doing this type of analysis much more quickly. So to kind of sum up there, we showed how when you're thinking about the top 3 common hurdles to PaaS migration, starting with that portfolio level view to develop that roadmap, identify applications, segment, and prioritize them, then starting to identify some quick wins to gain some quick confidence and credibility, and then drilling into specific applications and uncovering those obstacles, whether there are dependencies between applications or specific blockers or roadblocks in the application source code itself. The last thing I'll kind of leave you with is, for those of you here in attendance today, we do have an exclusive offer for all of today's attendees where you could get access to a free 1-month subscription of Cast Highlight. We have an offer for both government agencies and entities as well as commercial partners. So feel free to visit this website, enter that code, and you'll get access to try this out for yourself for 30 days. So just quick, by a show of hands, how many folks here from government? Okay, good. So we do have an offer for both types of attendees tonight. So thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for that.